Ruth Slater has been in prison for many years, but her sentence is coming to an end. The haunting memories from her past still haunt her. Vincent Cross, Ruth Slater's guardian, has arrived. Meanwhile, Ruth has received her belongings back. Vincent instructed her to remember the parole statute, according to which she must not break the law. She should also stay away from people with criminal backgrounds. Meanwhile, a girl named Catherine Malcolm is driving in a car. The girl gets a strange feeling, as if something is not right. Vincent reminds Ruth that she has no right to contact the victim's family. At that moment, both Catherine and Ruth remember their past. Together they experienced something no one should ever go through. Catherine becomes so lost in thought that she gets into an accident. Finally, Ruth is free. Vincent gave her a ride and offered to help her find a job. Ruth wanted to decline, but Vincent insisted, giving her the card of his friend who owned a fish factory. Catherine is in the hospital. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured. Her sister, father, and mother are very worried. Catherine, on the other hand, is worried that she won't have enough time to prepare for an important concert. Vincent brings Ruth to her new home. They will meet here every Tuesday at 11 a.m. without exception. Coldly thanking Vincent for his help, Ruth took her few belongings. Someone has been watching her all this time. Conditions in this dormitory are terrible. It's inhabited by people who are at the bottom of society. Ruth is introduced to her neighbors. Several people live in each cramped room. Upon learning that Ruth was released from prison for good behavior after 20 years, the victim's sons were disappointed. The Whalen brothers believe it's unfair, but Steve has accepted it, unlike Keith. Catherine is still in the hospital. The family is always by her side. The parents are worried about the accident. Rachel assumes that the daughter was upset because she accidentally saw a letter from prison, but Michael believes Ruth Slater has nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, Ruth has settled into the dormitory. That same evening, she received a phone call. A man was breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and then he insulted her. Later, looking at old photos, Ruth once again remembered the past. Keith takes care of his sick mother. Steve has a wife and child. Hannah noticed that her husband hasn't been himself in recent days. In the morning, a police car pulled up to the dormitory. It brought Ruth's mind back to the past. On that fateful day, Ruth and her younger sister were trying to be evicted from their home. In the end, Ruth took the policeman's life. Liz Ingram has a husband and 2 sons. They are a normal, happy family. Rewriting the bus schedule, Ruth went to the bus stop. She had become unaccustomed to being in society, so she felt uncomfortable. In the end, she almost missed the bus. Despite having a welding certificate, the employer refused to hire Ruth. It's obviously related to her past. Ruth had no choice but to go to the fish factory, as Vincent suggested earlier. The work is physically demanding and unpleasant, but Ruth is in no position to choose. After her night shift, a colleague offered to give her a ride, but Ruth declined. In the dormitory, Ruth frequently clashes with other women. In this place, like in prison, showing weakness is not allowed. Ruth went to the public library to find information about Katie Slater, her younger sister, on the internet. But instead, Ruth found articles about her own case. Once, this crime shook the entire country. Ruth passes by places that were once familiar to her. Liz Ingram was surprised to see some woman in her yard. It turned out to be Ruth, but Liz doesn't know her. Ruth remembers how Mac Whalen, a police officer, tried to convince her to leave the house. But Ruth had no intention of doing so, knowing that once she crossed the threshold, the sister would be taken away from her. In the present, John, Liz's husband, went out to Ruth and asked if he could help with anything. Ruth said she just wanted to see what had become of the house. It used to be not as beautiful. John mentioned that they had moved here a few months ago and invited Ruth inside. Liz doesn't understand what's happening. Inside, everything had indeed changed. But Ruth's haunting memories are still fresh. Ruth lied that she and her sister used to live next door together. Apologetically, Ruth hurried to leave, barely holding back tears. John called out to Ruth outside and offered her a ride, as it was getting dark soon. Ruth knows that John is a lawyer and discreetly asked him if he knew a good family law attorney. John realized that Ruth had been lying to him all this time and asked her to tell the whole truth. Ruth confessed that after their parents' demise, she and her sister lived in that house. Then Ruth went to prison, and her sister was adopted. That house is the last place they were together. For years, Ruth wrote letters to her sister but never received a response. Now Ruth doesn't even know if her sister is alive. Thanking John for everything, Ruth was about to leave. However, John really wanted to help her and left his card. Ruth clearly didn't expect such kindness from a stranger. Catherine was discharged from the hospital. The family is very supportive of her. Right now, Catherine is only thinking about her upcoming concert, but the nightmares from the past continue to haunt her. Catherine confessed to her sister Emily that she often sees a woman in her dreams but can't remember who she is or how they are connected. Emily suggested that Catherine find her real family. But Catherine doesn't want that. They are her family now. Ruth found a second job. Now she's a carpenter. Vincent advised her to tell her boss the truth about her prison past because sooner or later, it would come out. But Ruth doesn't want to be labeled. The rest of the time, Ruth works at the fish factory. All she wants is to save money and find her sister. This time Ruth agreed to the colleague's offer to give her a ride. The guy mentioned that he is a musician with his own band, but it doesn't bring in money yet. Immediately after her shift at the fish factory, Ruth headed to her second job. She has no idea that Keith is keeping an eye on her. Despite her injuries, Catherine plays the piano. At that moment, she remembered the strange woman who carried her. Ruth left a voicemail for John. Upon learning all the details of Ruth's case, John was contemplating whether he should help her. Ruth works diligently. The skills she learned in prison have come in handy. Keith, driven by hatred, continues to keep an eye on Ruth. She in turn can't let go of the past. Ruth's greatest fear is losing her sister. When Ruth heard someone calling out to her, she became cautious. Taking a tool, she went downstairs. It turned out to be Blake, her colleague from the fish factory. He just wanted to treat her to donuts and brought her a warm jacket. Ruth was bewildered by such kindness. No one had ever cared about her. Soon Ruth left another voicemail for John, who had stopped responding. She said that for 20 years, she had written thousands of letters to her sister, but nobody had replied. Ruth doesn't want to interfere with her sister's life or get a second chance. She just wants to know that Katie is okay. John is her only hope. Liz learned from Tyler, who was doing repairs in their home, about the Slaters who lived here many years ago. Tyler said that Ruth's father had voluntarily passed away, after which the sisters were left alone to live here. The sheriff came to evict them, and Ruth took his life. Steve learned from a police officer that Keith had recently inquired about Ruth Slater. Later, Steve demanded an explanation from his brother. Keith intends to seek revenge, while Steve wants to leave the past behind. With tears in his eyes, Keith said he couldn't allow Ruth to live as if nothing had happened. She deserves worse. Liz couldn't get the Slater family story out of her mind. In the evening when the husband returned from work, she asked how he could keep it from her. Liz was even more shocked when she learned that John intended to take on Ruth's case. John believes that Ruth served a deserved punishment and deserves a second chance, but Liz is convinced that people like her don't change. Steve visited his ailing mother. After her husband's demise, she began to abuse alcohol, causing them to lose their home. Looking at the parents' wedding photo, Steve couldn't hold back his tears. The next day, he saw Ruth while delivering construction materials to the site where she worked. Ruth had no idea that she was in the presence of the son of the man she had taken the life of. Steve asked many questions and acted deliberately polite. At some point, Ruth realized that something was amiss and told Steve to leave. Ruth also left, unaware that Steve had hidden in the house. Left alone, he searched through her belongings and found a photo of Katie and a letter addressed to her. Steve took a photo of it with his phone. Today was Tuesday, which meant it was time for her meeting with Vincent. He was unhappy that Ruth had hired a lawyer to arrange a meeting with her sister. Vincent advised Ruth to back off, as it would be better for Katie. At work, Ruth frequently interacted with Blake. She used to keep her distance from her colleagues, but now she didn't dine alone. Ruth also often met with Blake outside of work. She felt good and at ease when she was with him. In the mailbox, Michael found a letter from Ruth Slater's attorney and promptly called his wife. Rachel was of course in shock. The Whalen brothers met. Steve said he had talked to Ruth Slater. Now Steve agreed with his brother, considering all of this unfair. Steve suggested that Keith should get back at Ruth through her sister. Ruth and Blake chatted at a cafe. Ruth hadn't felt this good in a long time. Nevertheless, the past continued to haunt her. At some point, Ruth confessed that she had recently been released from prison after spending 20 years there. Initially, Blake thought she was joking, but it quickly became evident that she wasn't. Ruth didn't conceal the fact that she intentionally took the life of a police officer. Blake didn't know how to react. Ruth decided to leave, understanding that after this, Blake probably wouldn't want to communicate with her. It was painful for Ruth, so she cried while walking down the street. Meanwhile, Catherine was rehearsing, while her adoptive parents were contemplating what to do. Michael believed they should continue hiding the truth from Catherine. If Ruth tried to get close to Catherine, she would go back to prison. However, Rachel disagreed with her husband. Catherine was old enough, and there was no point in hiding the truth from her. That's why Rachel intended to call the lawyer. The spouses didn't know that Emily was eavesdropping on them. The next day at work, Ruth was attacked by a colleague, screaming that her father was also a police officer. During the scuffle, Ruth dropped her phone into the water. She realized that Blake had told everyone her secret. Blake watched Ruth throughout the shift but remained silent. During the break, she tried to turn on her mobile phone, but it was broken. After work, Blake attempted to talk to Ruth, but she didn't want to hear him out. Vincent was already waiting for her. Ruth now understood that Vincent was right. She is branded for the rest of her life. However, Vincent didn't come here for that. Since John couldn't reach Ruth, he asked Vincent to convey that Katie's adoptive parents were willing to meet. Now Emily knows that her parents are hiding something from them. Instead of going to school, she returned home and found letters addressed to Catherine. Meanwhile, Ruth prepared for the meeting. Catherine didn't even suspect that she had a sister. However, the young girl still remembered the strange woman. It made Catherine cry. John arranged a meeting for Ruth with Michael and Rachel, who refused to reveal their last name. Michael said that Catherine had suffered psychological trauma and didn't remember anything from her life before being with their family. She's doing well now, and Michael sees no point in disrupting everything. In turn, Ruth said that their mother passed away during childbirth. Since then, Ruth raised Katie, and their father never helped her. That's why it's important for Ruth to be a part of her sister's life now. Ruth also doesn't believe that Katie doesn't remember her at all. But Michael said that it's indeed the case. When Ruth asked if they passed her letters to Katie, Michael stated that they did what they thought was best. Upon hearing this, Ruth caused a scene. John tried to restrain her, but Ruth continued to shout. The Malcolm spouses told Ruth not to try to contact them anymore and left. John can't do anything more for Ruth. In the meantime, Emily was reading the letters and crying. Ruth returned to work. She was living on autopilot, seeing no purpose in it all. It turns out that 20 years of waiting were in vain. In an outburst of emotions, Ruth began to wreck the room. When she arrived at her second job, Blake attempted to talk to her again. Ruth didn't want to listen to him, but when Blake said that he had also been in prison, she fell silent. It turned out that he had been released on parole recently. But unlike Ruth, he hadn't found the courage to admit it. Blake sorry he blurted out Ruth's secret. He didn't mean to, it just happened. In the evening, Ruth received a call. Someone stayed silent on the line for a while, and then a girl's voice was heard. It was Emily, who told Ruth that she had read her letters. They agreed to meet. Meanwhile, Steve was spying on Emily, thinking she was Catherine. The girls really looked alike. Ruth arrived at the meeting place and waited for a long time. Finally, Emily came. Ruth remembered what Catherine was like in her childhood. Now Ruth wants to know what her sister has become. Emily said that Catherine plays the piano and is very talented. She also confirmed that Catherine doesn't remember Ruth but is gradually recalling something. Today Catherine has a rehearsal in the concert hall at 4 o'clock, so if Ruth wants, she can attend. After these words, Emily left. She doesn't suspect that Steve is following her. Ruth left a voicemail for John, saying that she has a chance to see Catherine today. Coming home, Steve heard his child crying. Steve puzzled over where his wife was. A minute later, he got the answer to that question when he caught Hannah with his brother. Steve attacked Keith and pushed Hannah, then left. Steve went to his mother's house and took a gun. Ruth arrived at John's office, but it turned out that he was traveling for work. So Ruth went to the Ingram's house to talk to Liz. Looking at this house, Ruth was immersed in memories again. In the past, after taking the police officer's life, she had escaped with her sister. Liz tried to drive Ruth away, believing she didn't deserve a second chance. Ruth screamed that she was just trying to protect her sister. After these words, Ruth burst into tears. Realizing that it wasn't that simple, Liz asked what really happened. On that fateful day, Ruth didn't let anyone enter the house, shouting that she had a gun. But the sheriff managed to enter through the back door. At some point, Ruth heard a gunshot and realized that Katie had found the gun. It was just a coincidence. Liz was shocked by this story. It turns out that Ruth served 20 years for a crime she didn't commit. Liz agreed to accompany Ruth instead of her husband. According to the law, Ruth cannot meet her sister alone. On the way, Ruth remembered how she brought her sister to a cafe after the escape. The police were looking for Ruth, so they had very little time. Tears in her eyes, Ruth asked the sister for forgiveness for making her do that. Katie doesn't understand what Ruth is talking about. The police are already here. Ruth understands that it's all over and doesn't attempt to escape. After saying goodbye to her sister, Ruth was about to turn herself into the police. Of course, Liz doesn't know these details. She had brought Ruth to the concert hall where Catherine would be rehearsing. Suddenly Ruth received a call from Steve, who said he had Catherine hostage. He gave Ruth the address and instructed her to come alone. Ruth pretended everything was okay and asked Liz to take her to the new address. Meanwhile, Keith tried to reach his brother on the phone, but he ignored the calls. Ruth was forced to confess to Liz that Katie was in danger. While Liz got into the car and called the police, Ruth followed all of Steve's instructions as they spoke on the phone. Ruth entered one of the buildings. Steve had a gun in his hands. Catherine was getting ready to play the piano. It wasn't her who was being held hostage, but Emily, who had been dragged into the situation by accident. Steve had mistaken her for Catherine. Ruth began to talk about Steve's father, who was kind and wanted to help her and her sister. Ruth deeply regrets taking his life. Steve didn't want to hear it. Ruth, on the other hand, continued to say that revenge wouldn't bring him any relief. Steve couldn't do it after all and screamed in despair. In the meantime, the police arrived, called by Liz. Steve still had a chance for revenge. Ruth blocked Emily with herself so she could run outside. At that moment, Ruth remembered how she surrendered to the police. Steve allowed Ruth to leave. Just like in the past, the police arrested her. Steve was also arrested. Michael received a call while Catherine continued to play. Upon learning of what had happened, Vincent immediately arrived at the scene and ensured that Ruth was released. For the first time in many years, Ruth saw Catherine, who had come here with her family. They silently looked at each other with tears in their eyes and then embraced. Catherine's parents didn't try to stop it. At that moment, the sisters remembered everything that had bound them together in the past.